My name is Clara Vance, and before we dive into this, I want you to take a second, look at the coffee in your hands, and breathe. If you're sitting down, good. If you're driving, just listen to the rhythm of my voice, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a story about a family inheritance or a legal dispute. It's a story about what happens when the people who are supposed to protect you decide that you are a guest in your own life. It's about the quiet, terrifying realization that you are only allowed at the table as long as you are useful. But the very second you ask to be wanted, the locks on the doors start to change. If you've ever had to sit in a room full of your own blood relatives and felt the sudden, freezing draft of realizing you're completely on your own, do me a favor. Type the word visible in the comments right now. Tell me where you're listening from, because I need to know how many of us have had to build our own foundations out of the scraps left behind by people who swore they loved us. My story didn't start with a massive, explosive argument. It started with a silence so thick you could hear the ice melting in a glass. It started 4 hours after I woke up in the intensive care unit at St. Jude's Memorial, with the taste of plastic tubing in my throat and a monitor rhythmic beeping above my left shoulder. I had suffered a severe concussion and internal bruising from a structural collapse at the old Millhouse estate, a property my grandfather had left to me, a property my stepmother, Evelyn, had been trying to get her manicured hands on since the late 90s. As I lay there, unable to move my head, the curtain to my cubicle didn't rustle. It parted slowly, precisely. Evelyn stepped in. She wasn't crying. She didn't have that frantic, disheveled look of a parent who had spent the night pacing a hospital waiting room floor. She was wearing her tailored top wool coat, her hair perfectly pinned back, smelling faintly of expensive lavender and cold rain. Behind her stood my father, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed firmly on the sterile linoleum floor. He looked like an afterthought in his own life. Evelyn didn't ask how I felt. She didn't touch my hand. Instead, she placed a smooth, leather-bound folder on the overbed table, sliding it just close enough that the shadow of it fell across my chest. "Clara," she said, her voice dropping into that low, practiced cadence she usually reserved for charity board meetings. "The doctors say the trauma to your head is extensive. Your father and I have spoken with the administration. We cannot have the estate fall into neglect while you are incapacitated. It's too much of a liability for a single woman in your condition. We've drafted a temporary protective care affidavit. It transfers the management and power of attorney over the Millhouse to your father. Sign it, dear. Let us carry the weight you were never structurally built to handle." I looked at my father. "Dad," I whispered, my vocal cords raw from the oxygen mask. He didn't look up. He just shifted his weight and mumbled, "Evelyn's right, Clara. It's for the best. We're just trying to keep you safe." That was the lie. Safe. In my family, safe was the word they used right before they took your keys. They thought I was too broken to notice the timestamp on the bottom of the legal document. They thought my mind was still floating in the fog of anesthesia. But as I stared at the paper, my eyes locked onto the printed date in the lower left corner. The document hadn't been drafted this morning while I was in surgery. It had been drawn up 2 months ago. They hadn't reacted to my accident. They had been waiting for it. They had built an entire architecture of exclusion, and they were just waiting for the perfect storm to trap me inside it. But what Evelyn didn't realize is that some foundations are built to withstand the storm, and my grandfather had left me a blueprint they never saw coming. I didn't sign the papers that day. I didn't scream either. When you grow up in a house where emotions are treated as a design flaw, you learn very quickly that raising your voice is just giving the other person ammunition. I simply closed my eyes, feigned a wave of exhaustion, and let the rhythmic, steady beep of the heart monitor fill the silence until Evelyn, with a sharp, synchronized click of her heels, pulled the leather folder back into her arms and left the room. But sitting here now, looking back at that moment, I realized the trap wasn't built in that hospital room. It had been laid brick by brick, year by year, throughout my entire childhood. Have you ever noticed how some families don't actually want you? They just want what you can do for them. They love the version of you that fits neatly into their portrait, the version that works the long hours, keeps the family secrets, and never asks for a single thing in return. For 12 years, since my biological mother passed away and Evelyn stepped into our lives, I was the daughter who stayed in the background. I was the one who managed the maintenance requests for my father's rental properties, the one who organized the holiday dinners, the one who made sure the family image remained completely unblemished in our small town. I was incredibly useful, but the moment I inherited the old Millhouse estate directly from my grandfather, bypassing my father and Evelyn entirely, my status changed. I went from being a helpful asset to a threat. If this is hitting a nerve for you today, if you've ever realized that your value in someone's life was entirely dependent on your compliance, take a deep breath. Type the word clarity in the comments below. Because recognizing the difference between being needed for your utility and being loved for your existence is the exact moment your chains start to loosen. I remember the exact afternoon the shift happened. It was 3 summers ago, long before my accident. We were sitting on the pristine white-tiled patio that Evelyn had insisted on installing over my mother's old rose garden. The space was beautiful, but it was cold, sterile. Evelyn was sipping her iced tea, her eyes tracking the precise line of the hedgerow, while my father adjusted the outdoor umbrellas. "Clara," she had said, not looking at me, but rather at the reflection of the house in her sunglasses. "The mill house is an eyesore in its current state. It doesn't match the trajectory of this family. We really should look into transferring the commercial lease to your brother's development group. It's a massive liability for a young woman to manage alone. You don't have the stomach for the modern market." My father had simply nodded, adjusting a strap on the patio furniture, completely silent. That was his role, the enforcer through absence. Every time Evelyn chipped away at my boundaries, my father provided the silent permission she needed to keep digging. I remember sitting there, feeling the heat of the summer brick beneath my shoes, swallowing down the urge to defend myself. I told myself they were just looking out for the family legacy. I made excuses for them because the alternative, admitting that my father preferred Evelyn's comfort over my peace, was too painful to face. But that is the danger of being the quiet one. People mistake your silence for a lack of awareness. They think because you aren't fighting back, you don't see the board. They don't realize that a person who is systematically excluded learns to observe everything. You start to notice the small things. The way a conversation abruptly dies when you walk into the kitchen. The way financial documents are left face down on the study desk. The moment your footsteps echo in the hallway. The way your boundaries aren't crossed with a frontal assault, but with a slow, polite erosion. By the time I was discharged from the hospital 3 weeks after my concussion, the fog in my mind had completely cleared, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. My body was still slow, my balance still slightly unsteady, but my eyes were wide open. I went back to my small apartment, bypassed the stack of get-well cards from Evelyn's church friends, and went straight to the closet where I kept my grandfather's personal belongings. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to look at the foundation they were so desperate to tear out from under me. The box was an old cedar chest, heavy and scratched at the corners, smelling of dried pipe tobacco, beeswax, and the damp soil of the western Pennsylvania hills. My grandfather, Arthur Vance, had been a man of straight lines and few words. He was a surveyor by trade, someone who literally spent his life defining boundaries, marking exactly where one person's right ended and another's began. When I lifted the lid that evening, the hinges let out a low, metallic groan that echoed in the quiet of my small living room. Right on top, wrapped in a yellowed piece of flannel, was his personal ledger from 1994. It was bound in a stiff, dark burgundy leather that had gone soft at the spine from decades of his thumb pressing into it. I sat down on the floor, my back against the sofa, my head still throbbing slightly from the residual pressure of the concussion. I pulled the ledger onto my lap. I remember a freezing Tuesday morning in the winter of 1994. I was just a little girl, sitting on a high stool at the kitchen island, watching grandfather carefully ink numbers into that very book. Across the room, Evelyn was leaning against the counter, casually sipping coffee, spinning a delicate web of words about modernizing the estate's deed structure to save on municipal taxes. Grandfather didn't look up. He just let his fountain pen scratch against the paper and said, "A boundary isn't a suggestion, Evelyn. It's a fact." Back then, I didn't understand the underlying current of that conversation. I didn't see the slow, patient chess match being played right over my head. But opening the ledger in 2026, with the benefit of hindsight and a cleared mind, the pages began to tell a completely different story. Grandfather's handwriting was an impeccable, slanted cursive. It wasn't just a record of property dimensions or timber yields from the millhouse land. It was a psychological map. Mixed in with the tax receipts and deed registries from 1994 were private, pencil-written annotations in the margins. On page 42, right next to the original survey coordinates of the millhouse boundary line, he had written, "E pressed again today regarding corporate consolidation of the holding company." She speaks of efficiency, but her eyes are on the absolute title. Roland lacks the stomach to look past the immediate comfort she provides him, must secure the baseline. I leaned forward, my breath catching in my throat. Secure the baseline. That was a surveyor's term. It meant establishing a fixed point of absolute certainty from which all other measurements are taken. If your baseline is off by even a fraction of an inch, every single line you draw afterward will be crooked. I flipped further into the back of the ledger, where the pages had been left mostly blank. There, tucked into a hidden pocket built into the leather lining of the back cover, my fingers brushed against a crisp, folded piece of parchment. It was a certified copy of a structural trust agreement, executed in October of 1994, witnessed by a retired county clerk, whose name I recognized from Old Town records. As I unfolded it, a small, handwritten note from my grandfather slipped out and landed on my knee. The ink was faded, but the message was razor sharp. "Clara, if you are reading this, it means the weather has turned, and they are trying to move the markers. Don't waste your breath arguing with people who don't respect the map. Go to the courthouse. Look at the baseline amendment of 1994. The ground under your feet is steadier than they think." I sat there in the silence, holding that piece of paper, feeling a strange, cold wash of relief pass over me. For years, Evelyn had made me feel like I was crazy. Like my attachment to the old mill house was just a stubborn, emotional phase I needed to outgrow for the sake of the family. She had used my father's silence to convince me that I was being difficult, selfish, and small-minded. But looking at my grandfather's neat, unhurried handwriting, I realized I wasn't crazy. I was just the only one who hadn't been bought off by the promise of an easy life built on someone else's sacrifice. Evelyn thought she had spent the last 30 years outsmarting a ghost. She thought by waiting until I was physically vulnerable, she could slip her affidavit across the table and finally finish the job. What she didn't know was that the surveyor had already marked the coordinates before she even knew how to play the game. The invitation came 6 weeks after my discharge, delivered not by a phone call, but via a heavy cream-colored envelope left in my mailbox. Inside was a note written in Evelyn's sharp, elegant calligraphy. It was an invitation to a formal family dinner at the main house, celebrating what she called my miraculous return to health. But when I walked through the front doors that Thursday evening, the atmosphere didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a corporate acquisition. The air smelled of roasted rosemary, beeswax candles, and the crisp, clean scent of fresh starch. Evelyn had set the long mahogany dining table with her finest linens and the silver that had belonged to my mother's family a subtle psychological flex she loved to deploy to remind me exactly who ruled the house now. My father was already seated at the head of the table, his hands folded over his linen napkin, looking down at his plate like a man waiting for a courtroom verdict to be read. Beside him sat my brother Julian, who was nervously tapping his fingers against his water glass. But it was the man sitting at the far end of the table who made my posture instantly straighten. He was wearing a charcoal gray tailored suit, his silver hair slicked back with military precision. Beside his bread plate sat a sleek black leather briefcase. I recognized him immediately. It was Richard Sterling, the senior partner of Sterling and Associates, the most aggressive corporate real estate firm in the county. Evelyn didn't just invite me to dinner. She had brought a mercenary. "Clara, darling," Evelyn purred, rising from her chair to offer me a superficial air kiss near my cheek. "You look so resilient. Sit, please. We've had the chef prepare something light for your stomach. We know you're still fragile." "I'm fine, Evelyn," I said, my voice calm, even, and thoroughly unhurried as I took my seat opposite Julian. "My doctors gave me a clean bill of health on Tuesday. The concussion is completely resolved." Evelyn's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed just a fraction. The tiny subconscious tell of a strategist who realized her opponent wasn't stumbling into the room on unsteady legs. As the first course was served, no one talked about my recovery. No one asked about the 6 weeks I had spent in physical therapy. Instead, Evelyn systematically steered the conversation toward the local commercial market. She spoke at length about Julian's development group, about municipal zoning changes, and about the tragic waste of historic properties that were left to rot under old-fashioned management. Finally, as the main plates were cleared, Evelyn gave a slight, synchronized nod to the attorney. Richard Sterling didn't hesitate. He opened his briefcase with 2 sharp clicks and slid a thick, bound document across the polished mahogany table, stopping it exactly an inch from my wine glass. "Clara," Sterling said, his voice dropping into a smooth, practiced baritone, "your parents have asked me to assist the family in restructuring the Vance estate assets. Given the recent structural issues at the Mill House property and the significant personal liability you faced during your accident, we've created a comprehensive solution." Evelyn leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the table, her rings catching the candlelight. "It's a master trust lease agreement, Clara. Julian's firm will take over full operational control, structural rehabilitation, and commercial development of the Mill House land. You will receive a fixed, modest quarterly dividend without having to lift a finger. We are removing the burden from your shoulders, dear. It's a selfless gift from your father and me to ensure your future is completely safe." I looked down at the document. The bold text at the top read, "Irrevocable commercial lease and asset assignment." If I signed this, the Mill House would essentially become Julian's property for the next 99 years, leaving me with a fraction of the income and absolutely zero legal say in its survival. I looked at my father. He finally raised his eyes to meet mine, his expression a mix of guilt and exhaustion. "It's a good deal, Clara," he whispered, copying the script Evelyn had undoubtedly rehearsed with him. "It keeps the property in the family. It prevents any more accidents." The trap was fully sprung. They were using my medical vulnerability as a weapon, framing an aggressive corporate asset grab as an act of parental benevolence. They expected me to break. They expected me to get emotional, to cry, or to storm out of the room, actions they could easily use to prove to the courts that I was mentally unstable and unfit to manage my grandfather's legacy. But as I placed my hand flat on the cool cover of the document, I felt an incredible, icy wave of clarity take over. They thought they had cornered a wounded animal. They didn't realize they had just walked into a room where the parameters had already been drawn. I didn't pull my hand back from the lease agreement. I didn't let my breath hitch, and I didn't give Evelyn the satisfaction of seeing my posture slump. If you've ever looked at someone spinning a web of absolute lies right to your face, someone who is smiling while they try to systematically dismantle your life, and felt nothing but pity because you already know how the story ends. Do me a favor. Type the word power in the comments right now. Because true power isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the one who controls the clock. Evelyn watched me, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her crystal wine glass, waiting for the crack in my facade. She had spent 12 years mastering the art of the polite ambush, and she expected me to do exactly what I did in my 20s. Get defensive, lose my temper, and make myself look like the unstable child she always claimed I was. Take your time reading it, Clara, she said, her voice dripping with that artificial, maternal warmth that always made my skin crawl. We don't expect you to understand the corporate jargon right away. Richard can explain the tax benefits to you slowly. I understand the jargon perfectly, Evelyn, I said, keeping my tone as level and unhurried as a Sunday morning. I turned my head slightly to look at Richard Sterling. This contract explicitly strips the primary title holder of all veto power regarding structural rezoning, and it shifts 92% of the equity growth directly into Julian's Development LLC. It's a beautifully written liquidation strategy. It's just missing a few key variables. Julian shifted in his chair, his face turning a sudden, blotchy red. Clara, come on. Look at what happened to you at the mill house. You almost died because that old timber joist gave out. You can't handle the maintenance. We're trying to save you from your own stubbornness. I looked at my brother, really looked at him. I didn't see a criminal mastermind. I saw a young man who had been coached by his mother to believe that taking what belonged to his sister was simply good business. The joist didn't give out because of age, Julian, I said softly, my voice carrying a weight that made the entire table go completely still. The joist gave out because the moisture barrier on the eastern foundation was deliberately compromised during your firm's unpermitted site survey last autumn. But we'll get to that. My father let out a low, shaky breath. Clara, what are you talking about? Roland, please, Evelyn interrupted, her voice snapping like a dry twig as she shot a warning look at my father. She turned her eyes back to me, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the cold, calculating operator underneath. Clara, this behavior is exactly why we are concerned. You are paranoid. The stress of managing that property is clearly affecting your neurological recovery. We have the legal right as your family to intervene when your judgment becomes a liability to the Vance estate name. You have the right to ask, Evelyn, I said, leaning back slightly in my chair, letting my hands rest loosely in my lap. But you don't have the map. There is an incredible psychological shift that happens when you stop fighting for acceptance from people who are incapable of giving it. For years, I wanted this family to see me. I wanted my father to look past Evelyn's curated schedule and notice that his daughter was drowning, trying to keep his life comfortable. But sitting at that table, looking at the silver that belonged to my biological mother, I realized I didn't need their validation to claim my space. I didn't need them to agree with the truth for the truth to be absolute. They thought my silence over the last 6 weeks was a sign of weakness, a symptom of a lingering concussion. They didn't realize it was the silence of a surveyor establishing the baseline. I reached down into the canvas bag I had left resting against the leg of my chair. I didn't rush. I pulled out my grandfather's 1994 dark burgundy leather ledger and placed it squarely on top of the irrevocable lease agreement Evelyn had slid toward me. Then, right beside it, I laid a crisp, white 70-page document bound by a professional blue spine. The title page read, Forensic Accounting and Structural Asset Audit, Vance Holding Company, Est, 1994. Richard Sterling's eyes instantly dropped to the ledger. He didn't move a muscle, but his professional posture stiffened. An experienced corporate attorney recognizes the physical shape of old liability records from a mile away. I remember the final afternoon I spent with grandfather in the hospital garden, just weeks before he passed. He was wrapped in a woolen blanket, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were completely clear as he pointed toward the brick walls of the old mill house. He looked at me and whispered, The loudest people in this world are always chasing leverage, Clara. The quietest people simply keep the receipts. Trust the baseline. Evelyn, I said, letting the silence stretch for a beat before I spoke. You spent the last 30 years believing that when grandfather restructured the Vance estate properties in 1994, he did it to shield the family from local municipality taxes. You believed it because that's the narrative you pitched to him, and you assumed he was too old and too traditional to see through it. But grandfather didn't build a shield for the family. He built a vault for me. Evelyn let out a short, condescending laugh, though her hand tightly gripped the stem of her wine glass. Clara, this is absurd. A leather notebook from 30 years ago doesn't alter a modern corporate asset structure. You are wasting Mr. Sterling's billable hours. Actually, Evelyn, it changes everything, I said, sliding the blue-bound forensic audit directly into Richard Sterling's field of vision. If you turn to page 14 of the audit, you'll find a certified copy of the baseline amendment of October 1994, which my grandfather quietly registered with the County Recorder of Deeds 3 days after your initial corporate filing. Richard Sterling didn't wait for Evelyn's permission. He pulled the audit toward him, his thumb flipping through the pages until he reached the certified document. His eyes scanned the text, his eyebrows knitting together as his face slowly went completely pale. "What is it, Richard?" Evelyn asked, her voice losing its smooth, rhythmic cadence, snapping into a sharp, defensive register. "It's a standard historical title attachment. It has no bearing on Julian's current lease option." Sterling didn't look at Evelyn. He kept his eyes locked onto the parchment copy. "It's not a standard attachment, Louise." "Excuse me, Evelyn," he stammered, correcting himself as his professional composure began to crack. Arthur Vance inserted an ironclad cross-collateralization reversion clause into the foundational deed of 1994. It states that any attempt by a secondary family member or a subsequent corporate entity to lease, rezone, or alter the structural footprint of the Millhouse property without the explicit, notarized signature of the primary bloodline heir, which is Clara, instantly triggers a mandatory structural audit of the entire Vance holding company. The room went entirely cold. Julian leaned forward, staring blankly at the attorney. "What does that mean? What does a structural audit have to do with my development group?" I looked directly at my brother, then at Evelyn, whose mouth had opened slightly, her face frozen into a mask of pure shock. "It means, Julian, that by sending your unpermitted survey crew to alter the foundation of my mill house last autumn, and by drafting this lease agreement tonight, you didn't secure the estate. You triggered the vault." I tapped the blue binder. The forensic audit I completed while recovering from my concussion reveals that over the last 7 years, Evelyn has been systematically siphoning funds from our father's residential rental accounts to bankroll your development LLC's commercial debts in Delaware. Because you triggered the 1994 reversion clause, the entirety of those accounts must now be legally frozen tomorrow morning, pending a formal judicial review by the County Orphans Court. Your entire commercial development group isn't about to acquire the mill house, Julian. It's about to be completely dismantled by the state bar. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that has weight, the kind that makes you realize every choice you've ever made has finally caught up with you. Richard Sterling slowly closed the blue-bound binder, placed his hands flat on top of it, and pushed his chair back from the mahogany table. The sharp, mechanical click of his leather briefcase snapping shut sounded like a starter pistol in the quiet room. "Evelyn," Sterling said, his voice stripped of all professional warmth, sounding flat and entirely transaction-driven. "I am withdrawing my firm from this matter effective immediately. This isn't a restructuring. This is a liability field. I strongly suggest you retain separate criminal and financial counsel before the County Orphans Court opens its docket tomorrow morning." "Richard, wait," Evelyn whispered, her hand trembling so violently that her gold rings clinked against the stem of her wine glass. We have a retainer. You represent the Vance estate. I represent the corporate entity, Evelyn, Sterling said, standing up and smoothing the front of his tailored charcoal coat. And according to the baseline documentation Clara just laid on this table, she is the entity. Good night. He didn't wait for my father to stand, and he didn't look back as he walked out of the dining room. The heavy oak front door of the main house clicked shut a moment later, leaving the four of us trapped in the space Evelyn had spent 12 years curating to perfection. Julian was staring down at his hands, his face completely pale, his chest heaving as the reality of his financial exposure began to sink in. "Mom," he muttered, his voice sounding incredibly small, stripped of all the arrogant, corporate bravado he had walked into the room with. "What did you do? You told me the grandfather's trust was just a formality. You told me she couldn't fight it." Evelyn didn't answer him. She couldn't. For the first time since she had walked into my life, her posture was completely broken. She sat slumped in her chair, staring at the 1994 leather ledger like it was a ghost that had just pulled up a seat at her table. The elegant, strategic mastermind who had systematically erased my mother's rose garden and tried to weaponize my ICU concussion was gone. In her place sat a panicked woman who realized that every single line she had drawn over the last 30 years was completely crooked. I turned my head to look at my father. He hadn't moved. He was looking at me, his eyes wide and watery, his mouth opening and closing slightly, as if he were trying to find a script that would fix what he had allowed to happen under his own roof. "Clara," he said, his voice cracking. I didn't know about the siphoning, I swear to you. I thought Julian's firm was just helping you manage the upkeep. I'm your father." "I know who you are, Dad," I said softly, my voice carrying a calm, steady weight that filled every corner of the room. "You're the man who stood by and let her rewrite the map because it was easier than standing up for your own daughter. You wanted the comfort of her illusions, but a baseline doesn't care about your comfort. It only cares about the truth." I didn't wait for him to apologize. I didn't need him to cry or beg for forgiveness to feel whole. I stood up, smoothing the front of my sweater, and picked up my grandfather's ledger and the forensic audit. I looked at the three of them one last time, not with anger, not with hatred, but with a profound, unshakable sense of finality. They had built an entire world on appearances and control, and it had completely fallen apart in under an hour. Not because I attacked them, but because I simply refused to let them move the markers anymore. I turned on my heel and walked out into the cool, crisp night air, leaving them alone in their silent boardroom. I want you to take a look at your coffee one last time. If it's gone cold, that's okay. Rebuilding a life takes time, and sometimes things have to cool down before you can see them clearly. It's been months since that Thursday evening at the main house. The County Orphans Court did exactly what my grandfather's 1994 baseline amendment dictated. They froze the accounts, initiated a forensic receivership, and dismantled Julian's development group brick by brick. Braxton Whitmore, the attorney who had helped them set up their hidden Delaware entities, quietly filed a voluntary withdrawal from the state bar to avoid formal prosecution. Evelyn and my father still live in that big, white, sterile house on the hill, but the silence inside it belongs to them now. They don't call me, and I don't call them. Sometimes walking away from your own blood isn't an act of anger. It's an act of survival. It's admitting that you cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick. If you are sitting somewhere tonight feeling like a tenant in your own life, if you are making excuses for people who treat you like an asset instead of a human being, I want you to type the word boundaries in the comments right now. Let this channel be the place where you stop trying to earn a seat at a table that was never built for you. Last week, I finally finished the restoration on the old mill house. I didn't hire a commercial crew, and I didn't use cosmetic shortcuts. I went down to the local hardware store, bought a bag of thin-set mortar, and got down on my knees on the damp floor behind the old foundation wall. I mixed the mortar myself. I cleared away the cracked, broken debris that Julian's survey crew had left behind, and I set a new stone cleanly into the baseline. It was slow, careful, honest work, the kind of work my grandfather would have made me do. Not a temporary fix, not a lie dressed up as a repair. Actual mortar, actual work. As I stood up and wiped the gray dust from my hands, I looked out the window at the western Pennsylvania hills, stretching out under a clear, open sky. For 32 years, I thought my job was to keep the peace, to make myself smaller so that everyone else could feel big. But looking at that steady, newly set stone, I realized that true peace isn't the absence of conflict. True peace is knowing exactly where your boundaries are and having the strength to stand on them. Somewhere tonight, a child is being made to feel like a mistake, or an afterthought, or a secondary character in their own family story. But somewhere else, an aunt, a friend, a neighbor, or a quiet grandfather is keeping the receipts, waiting to show them a way out. If you are one of those people standing in the doorway for someone else, thank you for showing up. Subscribe if this story hit close to home, because my grandfather kept a promise from beyond the grave that I couldn't have kept alone. And this is exactly what his work looks like when it's finished. They called me a tenant, but I grew up knowing the map.